When I got to Biola, the area that I began to study was intercultural studies, and it was fascinating to learn the social science behind being culturally adaptable, how people get along and how people are different. It was primarily geared towards preparing people for missions, and that's what I was preparing for. But the more I began to learn this stuff, cultural anthropology, social anthropology, and stuff like that, I started realizing this is applicable in a lot of different settings. If you're going to be in the State Department or doing some type of diplomacy, the same skills would be appropriate. If you're doing international business, you would need to know these things. And so I've had the opportunity since then to apply the same skills in a business setting and in doing research in different parts of the world, and find that while it's rooted in science, it's also very biblical, these principles of adapting to different cultures. And one of the places in which cultural distinctions and differences come up consistently is when you get in a conflict with someone. Because we have default methods of responding to conflict that are both cultural and sort of personality-based, things that are just sort of personality preferences. Today, our focus is going to be on the redemption of the nations. What does it look like for God to reconcile the world to himself and to reconcile us to each other, and to do that on a large scale among tribes and nations? And what is our part in that? That's what we're going to be looking at today. But what I want to show you is some principles of conflict, styles of approaching a conflict that will be helpful both at an interpersonal level and at a global level. So we're going to start off just talking about the principles. We'll show how they work at an interpersonal level, and then we'll scale them up and show how when you have groups that are in conflict with one another, the same approaches actually play out in resolving those conflicts. So that's where we're headed today. But let's start off by getting to know each other a little better. So if you would tell me a little bit about you. I told you where I'm from. I'd like to know your name, where you're from, and then why you picked this particular session to come to, because there's so many great options out there. So just raise your hand if you've got an answer for me. Yes, what's your name? Adam. See, dude, it was meant to be. It was meant to be. Okay.
So I just enjoy the experience, just understanding the conflict behind it, and seeing, different cultures interacting, because you don't have that name.
That's hilarious. I don't know if you guys could all hear Adam. Could you hear him over there? He's saying he's from Maine, and there are only white people in Maine. So he really enjoys learning about different cultures. That's a riot. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. All right, thanks, Matt. Appreciate that, man. Welcome. Anybody else over here? Yes.
My name is Andrew. I'm from Virginia, I guess, and California. I chose this session because I actually went and saw Irvine.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I've lived all over the country and just seen the different cultures, different, and I guess there's just not people that live in different cultures.
Great to meet you, Andrew. And another one, just one more person. Okay, somebody's pointing to you, just letting you know. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Eric, and I'm from Chicago. And I chose this session just because it sounded cool and like just diversity and everything. And Biola, especially Austin, this is Southern California.
All right. Great. Well, welcome. Thanks for introducing yourself, and great to have you. Well, we are going to be talking, as I said, about how conflict scales up when it's a group. One of the passages that we looked at in the morning session was from Ephesians chapter 2, and I want to pray for us, and then we'll read this again just to show us what we're going to be talking about and how it shows up in Scripture, the principle as it's explained in Scripture. Father, in Ephesians 2:13 through 16, we read, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Throughout the Old Testament, we read this word, nations, which comes over into Greek and then is translated as Gentiles. The word from the Hebrew is the word for nations, and it's mentioned over and over hundreds of times in the Old Testament. And you start to see a pattern as you look at all the times in which this word occurs. Many times it's used in a negative sense. It's talking about the wickedness of the nations, the practices of the nations, the fact that the nations are being driven out in order to allow Israel to take the land. And God will contrast his people and saying, don't adopt the practices of the nations. Or God will say, one day you will rule over the nations. I will give them to you as an inheritance, and so forth. But then you'll have these other passages where God is talking about how he will call the nations to himself, how the nations will all be reconciled to him, and that they will all one day call upon God. And we see that being played out in the book of Revelation as well. So there's this destiny that all the nations will ultimately come to God. But this contrast between God's people, chosen people, and the nations occurs throughout the Old Testament. And so there's a history of a conflict between God's people and the rest of humanity known as the nations. We're looking at one particular example of this hostility that we looked at earlier this morning, but I think it's worth revisiting, and that is the experience of this group called the Amalekites. We talked about how they attacked Israel on their way out of Egypt. As they're exiting Egypt, here come these people, the Amalekites, that went after the weak ones, the stragglers, and attacked them in the rear. And God looked at this injustice and was so angry about it that he said, I'll be at war with them from generation to generation. I want to read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 25, Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19, where God is talking about the importance of remembering. He says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you and did not fear God. And therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. How many of you heard these two words used together, forgive and forget? Have you ever heard those? The Bible commands us not to forget. In fact, here Israel is told about the things that were done to them, you shall not forget. Israel is commanded, you will remember what they did to you. And not only that, God says, because of it, you're to be at war with them. And he tells them specifically how he wants them to carry that out. He says, you're going to go into the land. I'm going to give you peace. You'll be settled down. And then I want you to wipe these people out from the face of the earth. Wow. How many of you have ever heard the phrase, revenge is a dish best served cold? Everybody ever heard that one? Some of you are like, yeah, man, that's how I roll. Yeah, you know, it reminds me of a story that it's pretty sad in the long run. I was a very skinny, scrawny kid growing up, and there was a guy, one of my brother's friends actually, he's about 3 years older than me, and we just kind of get roughhousing and stuff like that, playing around, but eventually he started getting really rough with me, and I was crying, and then after I'm hurting and I'm crying, then the guy's like teasing me, laughing at me, and I'm thinking to myself, he's so much bigger than I am, you know? And, you know, resentment starts to build up. And then this idea, I don't know if I would have put it into those words, but the idea of serving a dish cold to him comes to mind. So I'm waiting till the guy's completely calmed down, and he and my brother are talking, and I just come casually walking by, and then threw a punch with everything I could muster, I mean, from the floor up, and hit this guy in the eye, and just watched his eye swell up and close right in front of me. It was just, you know, huge shiner on his eye, You know, looking back at it, I'm like, man, it was just horrible, but the punch connected. I mean, it's perfect. Pow, right in the eye. Got to remember why I told that story. You know what happens is if we allow resentment and anger to fester, this is how it will then leak out. But in this case with Israel, God is telling them that's exactly how he wants them to operate. And hundreds and hundreds of years later, along comes King Saul. And King Saul, as we talked about, he does not carry out this order completely. He leaves the king Agag alive, and he loses the kingdom because he refuses to carry out the order to exterminate these people, the Amalekites. The Amalekites continued to hassle Israel for years to come. Even when King David took over, and King David is living in a place called Ziklag, it was the Amalekites that came in and attacked David's family, took his family away, kidnapped them. So the war continued for years to come. For you and I, if you grow up in an American context, we are very culturally different from a lot of people in other parts of the world. We tend to be a very individualistic people. If you look at, for instance, a guy named Gertz Hofstede who measures distinctions in national cultures, one of the things he noticed is the United States is really high on the individual scale. And you can see that playing out in all of our heroes. How many of you have seen a Tom Cruise movie at some point in your life? Okay, I'm not going to ask you which one because the plot is the same. So basically, this guy has some kind of daddy issues, you know, maybe he doesn't know what happened to his dad, you know, and then he's got a problem with authority, and he doesn't like to follow rules, like to do things his own way, and whether it's, you know, driving a car or flying a plane or trying to stop world destruction through an espionage organization. It's all the same. He's this individualistic guy. At the end of the day, he does it all his way in defiance of the rules, and he always wins. Now you go back a little further, you'll find Clint Eastwood playing the same role with you know, guns in the West, and you find John Wayne doing the same thing. This is basically an American icon of the rugged individual that defies all the rules, does his own way, and wins. We are a rebel nation. We began by rebelling against King George, and this is part of our mythology. But other parts of the world view the world through a very collective lens. It's a group thing. And that group thing extends back for generations. And just to kind of get us in the feel of what this is like, we're going to take a game that's usually played on an individual basis, and we are going to play it on a group basis. So we're going to try to make that work. That's coming up. Just letting you know that's coming up. For those of you who are thinking, I can't sit through another lecture. I got to stay awake. There's a game coming. But right now, let's get into styles of conflict. Now, what I'm about to show you is 5 distinct styles. These are approaches to conflict. There are five distinct styles of conflict, and each one of them they're personality-based. In other words, you'll have one that just feels right to you. And at the same time, they're situational-based, which means each approach, each style of conflict will have a time in which it's appropriate, 1 out of 5, and then there'll be 4 times when it's not appropriate. Does that make sense? Okay, let's take a look at those. This was developed by a guy named Craybill, and so he has an assessment actually for this called Style Matters. You can take this assessment, it'll tell you what your normal style is. It'll also tell you how you can approach a person of a different style. So it's a very helpful tool. I use it in consulting with corporations, individuals, as well as churches. And what it measures is, at any given moment, how much are you focused on the relational connection, and how much are you focused on achieving your agenda or your objective? And as you measure these 2 things at the same time, on an axis, you end up with these 5 styles. So let's take a look at them. These are the these are the 5 styles. They are directing. I'm going to do them in this order: directing, avoiding, harmonizing, compromising, or cooperating, and then compromising. And let's look at them individually. So first one, directing. Directing says we are focused on our agenda. Wait a minute, I'm hitting buttons here. Okay. We're focused on our agenda, it's very high, but our focus on relationship is low. So the idea is I win, you lose. And it's by asserting control, competing, insisting, and demanding on your way. How many of you think this is a good style? Okay. Got one person who's kind of halfway there. Now, you guys aren't really impressed with this. Okay, let me give you a scenario. If there's a fire in here, the place is burning, and I am a fireman. I come in here, what style do you think I'm going to use? Everybody out, hit the door. No, I don't want to hear your opinion. We're going to do it my way. Get out. Right? And I'm telling you, in that situation, that is the appropriate style. Directing. Just do it my way now. Because the issue is the agenda of getting everybody out safe. It doesn't matter whether you like me at the end of the day, you'll be alive if you do what I tell you. It's the same thing every parent understands. When your kid steps off the curb, you snatch the kid back before they get hit by a car. You're not going to have a conversation about that until maybe afterwards. It's the same thing if parents say, look, do your homework. No, we're not negotiating. Just do it. So directing is a style that is appropriate in certain situations. Certainly if you are in any kind of a command situation where you need a team of people to operate in sync and immediately, you need somebody who's able to operate in this command style. And there are some situations where there may be a conflict, but even though there's a conflict, the style that works best is this directing style. Now, I'm going to jump actually to the harmonizing one. Harmonizing is where you say, you know, I don't really care right now about the agenda. Is it doing that on its own? I'm going to have a conflict with this PowerPoint. All right, this one's good. Keep my hand on the button. Harmonizing is when you say, I actually value the relationship right now. And I want to make sure that the relational connection is good. And I don't really care that much about the agenda. So it's the exact opposite of the directing style. When might this be appropriate? How many of you, first of all, think this is a good approach? Never mind the agenda. Let's just maintain the relational connection. You got that? What's your name, man? Micah. He's like, I'm all over that. I like that one. Good one. Anybody else? You like this style? The one way in the back. Okay, there's like 5 of you. That's great. These are the harmonizing people. Those of you who want somebody you will always get along with, these are your people. Now, I'm going to talk to the guys for a minute. I'll give you a scenario in which this style is very much appropriate. Why is that already funny? Why is it already funny? You're about to go on a date and you want to go see a movie. And you're thinking to yourself, I want to see the action movie, but I also want to see a movie with her. And she doesn't want to see the action movie. Now at that point, you've got a bunch of options. You could say, look, let's just each go see our own movie. I mean, I'm going to see my action movie, you know, get some popcorn. We'll see you afterwards. It'll be all good. You could go that route. Or you could say at that point, I don't care that much about my agenda of seeing the latest, you know, blow it up sci-fi movie. I just want to be with her. And you just let it go and you win the relational points and you're not going to pay attention to the movie, you're going to pay attention to her, and the relational connection is great. I'm telling you, it served you well. There are lots of situations in which this is a good one, where you can let the issue, whatever it is, go and maintain the relationship, right? That is harmonizing. Now, you can also imagine how this could be overused. If you harmonize consistently, there may be times when you really gave up something that was actually very important to you. You do that a few times and eventually you're going to blow up and say, I'm always giving in, when the other person didn't even necessarily realize that's what you were doing. Just like the directing style that we looked at a moment ago. Can you imagine a person who always uses that style? There's a sentence that Jesus said, a statement that he said that no other person should ever be able to say. You are my friends if you do as I command. Only Jesus should be able to say that. But a person who uses the directing style all the time, that's pretty much it. It's always got to be my way. You are my friends if you do as I command. So you see how each of these is appropriate within the right context. There's another style here. How many of you like this one? This is where, okay, nice try, we're back. How many of you like this one? This one is saying, I'm not that interested in the relational connection right now, and I'm not that interested in my agenda either. So my approach to the conflict is avoidance. I'm going to avoid bringing it up. I'm going to avoid going deep. I had one person who was in a marriage who was describing his marriage this way. He said, you know, there are just certain topics that are like boxes that we put the lid on them and we just don't open that box. He said he got to a certain point in his marriage where he realized he's walking around the living room and it's all full of boxes, you know. It's things that we just, before you know it, the relationship doesn't really have a whole lot of depth to it because there's too many topics that are off the table. So avoidance, though, how many of you just think, hey, I kind of like that approach, though. I like that approach to conflict. Whenever there's a conflict going on, my approach is, let's just not talk about it. In fact, we don't need to talk at all. Some of you got your hands up. You're like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Can you think of a scenario in which this is definitely the best approach? Anybody? Yes.
You just had a meeting of center and we need to do
You said, what did you say? What was it about? Perfect. Got it. Tell me your name. Samuel just brought up a great one. He says if you're in a situation, it's a conflict where somebody is trying to assault you sexually. For that matter, they're trying to assault you, period. Even if you're in a relationship with someone and that conflict, that argument begins to escalate to the point where it becomes violent, where this person is dangerous, your best approach to that conflict is not to say, hey, you can't do that to me. Your best approach in that conflict is to avoid it. Get out of that situation. And it may be an immediate threat in which you need to get away immediately. It may be a long-term threat where this person is consistently dangerous. And your best approach to conflict with that individual is to avoid them. Don't try to maintain a relational connection with them, and don't try to get your agenda accomplished with them. Hey, you're supposed to wash those dishes, I said. Maybe not. I know a friend who was actually stabbed by his spouse. I know people who were abused physically by their spouse or by a dating partner and stuff like that. Man, there are some situations you just want to get away from, and this is the best approach to it. Now, if this is your normal, everyday approach to all of your relationships, where anytime something comes up, it's a conflict, and you just avoid that person because we're not getting along right now, pretty soon you will be very isolated, and that's why we use a turtle for this one. Okay. It's, all right. Now this style, cooperating, is where there's a high focus on your own agenda. I really want to get what I want to get. There's a high focus on maintaining the relational connection. And so what we're looking for is a win-win situation. And we dialogue and we talk until we agree and we come up with a way that we all get what we want. I can tell you about a scenario in which this style was employed. But first of all, how many of you like this style? You think this is a good one? Well, there's a lot more hands. Most of you like this one. Wow, okay. Here's when this works well. Our church was looking for a facility. We now lease a second floor of an office building. But we had been turned down over and over again, and we turned in an offer, and this owner of this building this time, he says, no, I'm going to reject your offer. But he said, before I reject your offer, I'd like to talk to you. And he and I met one-on-one. And as we got talking, we talked it through enough to where I understood what he needed financially. He understood what I needed financially. He's saying, I need to lower my broker fees. I need to lower my taxes. He's saying, I can see from your situation, you need to lower your upfront cost, and you could probably pay more later on. At the end of the day, he created, and we worked together on this, we created a lease that was way better for us than the original one that he had rejected. He said, aren't you glad I rejected the lease that you wanted in the first place? I'm like, yeah. Then the guy shows up. We've been there now for a couple years. He shows up last week and he says, I've got another lease proposal for you. You just renewed your option. I want to change it. And here's an offer that lowers your rent by $4,000 a year. How do you feel about that? So let me think about it. Okay. And what he was doing, he had maneuvered it so that his fees went down again, his taxes went down. And what he was doing is thinking it through and saying, how can I make sure you win? I know you well enough. I know what you really want. I want to make sure you get what you want, and I want to make sure I get what I want. You can look at this and say, man, this is a style we should use all the time, right? Win-win. Can you think of a time when this is not the right style? Yeah. It takes a lot of time, exactly. When you need to make a quick decision, you're not going to be able to pull this off. Let me tell you how this plays out on a larger scale. United States government. You got you have the Republicans and the Democrats, right? And they are arguing about stuff and, intractable in their positions on the, no, we are not going to raise taxes, and no, we are not going to cut social spending, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and we're not compromised, we're not going to do it, and until they play this brinksmanship right up till the end, till the government's about to shut down, and then they're like, all right, look, you lose a little, we lose a little, let's just agree to this deal that everybody loses with these draconian approaches to everything and just almost wreck the economy. Let's do it that way. And that's what they come up with, right? And so that approach is called compromising. A compromise is where it says, look, I'm going to get some of what I want. You'll get some of what you want. You lose a little, I lose a little, but we can get it done quickly. It's less of a focus on the relationship, and it's less of a focus on agenda. It's a little bit of both, but it gets it done quickly. So you can see how each of these has its appropriate scenario. Now, you can think about this in interpersonal relationships, and we've talked about it primarily in that setting, but this scales up. This is something that you would do if you're dealing with international negotiations as well. There are times when you're dealing with organizations or groups of people, ethnic groups, or when you're dealing even with nations, where the main thing you want to do is avoid. That's called a ceasefire, where you say, look, we just want to stop the immediate hostilities, and no, we don't want to negotiate, we don't want to talk, let's just cool it down for a while. And then after you've begun to cool it down, then you start to kind of find out what each person's perspective might be. And you get a little bit more into the conversation that leads to a compromise or possibly even to cooperation at some point. There are times in large-scale conflicts also when another person that you're negotiating with is so bent on your destruction that you feel like the only approach you could take is a directing one, where you say, for the time being, I can't let you have what you want, because what you want is my complete annihilation. I can't let that happen. So you see how groups use these same approaches. Sometimes groups will harmonize, where they say, right now we are in a powerless position, and the other group is so powerful that the best thing we can do is go along with them for the time being. Those who live under consistent oppression find that this is their best approach when they are dealing with a more powerful enemy. But individualism is such a natural thing for you and I that I want to remind you that not only do these styles play out on a large-scale level, on a group level, but when our hero Solomon looked at the world and saw all of these examples of oppression that depressed him to the point where he was practically suicidal, he said there was one approach to life that actually made sense. He saw the person who was the workaholic that didn't have anybody to share his wealth with. This is in chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes. And he said, that doesn't make any sense. Why are you working so hard when you got nobody to share it with? Just being sort of the driven individualist in that situation makes no sense. Then he looked at the person who was also just kind of relying on themselves, but the oppression had overwhelmed them to the point where they said, I just don't want to play anymore, and they folded their hands and gave up. He said, that doesn't make sense either. You're all you've got. Why would you give up? But he saw one thing that made sense. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9, we read these words, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. And again, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. Amen. That one in the King James says, when 2 lie down together, there is heat. Those of you who get married, you'll understand what I'm saying there. And those of you who are not married, this is not a marriage seminar. Those who are not married, just imagine a group of puppies, and you put the puppies on the floor, you scatter the puppies all over the floor. Give them a few minutes, they'll all be piled up on top of each other. Puppies understand this principle. So they keep warm. Okay. All right. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Essentially what Solomon is saying here is it's better to think in terms of group, because in doing so, Economically, you do better. We understand that in capitalism. When you start to pool your investments, when you have stockholders, you do a initial stock offering, and you get more people involved in the financing of your enterprise. Through capitalism, you will do better, and your company can expand, etc. You see it on the opposite side of capitalism. Those who are in the labor force, and they believe in collective bargaining, and they come together as a labor force and begin to negotiate with the owners of production, and they find that collectively, as a group, they get a better return as they bargain with those who own the means of production. So whether you're a capitalist or whether you're labor-oriented, you find the same principle is playing out, better economic reward. The next thing, there's a comfort in being together. And Solomon is saying, if you don't experience the joy of having somebody to share things with, of just having the comfort of doing life with somebody else, you're missing out. And Israel understood this principle. The context of the Bible is people valued being part of the group, so much so that one of the worst penalties you could ever experience, God warns, if you do this, you will be utterly cut off from your people. Nobody wanted to be cut off from their people. The text talks about those who fall down. There are times when you're just not going to have it together. And as you fall down, there's somebody to help you up. And the community becomes that source of support. And then when you're attacked, the ability to defend yourself. And in a conflict situation, this is what we're dealing with. People who have come to understand that together we can defend ourselves. What that means is that your problem becomes my problem. Here's how I grew up. I went to a school, elementary school at one point. It was a Catholic school, and there were 2 black families initially when we went there. One was my cousins, that family, and the other was me and my brother and sister. And so because we're in a setting where there are a lot of people, different ethnic backgrounds, there's a lot of Irish and German primarily in these schools, my dad sat me down at one point and he says, if your cousin gets in trouble, if there's a fight that's breaking out and somebody is going to beat up your cousin, I don't want to hear about your cousin getting in a fight and you not getting involved. And I'm there, I'm like maybe 6, 7 years old, and I'm like, Dad, are you telling me you want me to fight? He says, if your cousin is attacked by somebody, absolutely, son, I want you to fight. I get this grin on my face, Oh. And sure enough, my cousin who's in my grade, my cousin Patrick, man, that dude could talk. I hope he sees this video. He would talk himself into stuff, and I'd just come running, and we'd get into it together. But eventually people realized, well, you fight one of them, you got the whole group to deal with. My dad was the youngest of 15 children. He was an uncle when he was born. There are now over 300 Edgerlys up in the Bay Area. And eventually people began to realize, you don't want to mess with that tribe. You don't want to mess with that tribe, right? I want you guys to experience this a little bit, and so we're going to pause right now, and we're going to play a little game, and I hope that the game is familiar to you. So, have you guys seen this game before? Never heard of it? Okay. Well, it's going to be a bit of a simulated game, because there's a lot of people in here, and I think I figured out a way that we can still play. First thing to do is break you up into 2 groups. So we got the group on the right here. You guys are a group. Rah, rah for your group. Okay? And we got the group on the left here, and you guys are a group. Okay? Wow. It's very impressive, very impressive. So you guys are going to be called the group on the right, and you guys will be called the group on the left, just because creativity takes time. So can you guys see this cursor here? All right. So your team, group on the right, if you would pick some kind of a token that you're going to use. What? The hat. Okay, we got a hat over here. What's your token? Okay, the first one I heard was money bags. Okay. They don't like that. Okay, we're going to use the directing style right now. We're going with the first thing I heard. You guys are money bags. Okay, we got money bags and we got the hat. All right, let's play the game. So here's how the rules are played. You may think you already know the rules because it's Monopoly and you figure out we already know how to play that. The rules are a little different, so let me explain to you how it goes. So first, it's talking to you group on the right here. We're going to roll the imaginary dice, okay? and then you guys are going to move forward, and wherever you land, you will have the option of buying that property. Now, you have a lot of money, so you know how the game plays. So for the group on the left, it's going to be very similar rules. The only difference is that you won't be allowed to buy property because you guys are pretty much broke, okay? So let's go ahead and start. All right. Here we go. All right, we are rolling the dice. We start with go. And we're going, oh man, you're rolling the dice, and whoa, yeah, I don't know what number that is, but you ended up on St. James Place. Do you want to buy it? Yes. Okay, well, great. We have a special deal going on today where it's a 3-for-1. So not only do you get St. James Place, but you get States Avenue and Virginia Avenue as well, and you have a monopoly. Give yourselves a hand. Awesome. You guys are so hardworking and industrious. You rock, okay? And I have much respect. All right, let's play for you guys. Group on the left, here we go. We are rolling the dice, and oh, you're moving along, and whoa, you come along here, and yes, you landed on St. James Place. Ooh. Oh, is that Virginia Avenue. That's what I mean. Virginia Avenue. There we go. So it's owned by these guys, so you have to pay them rent. Okay, now we're rounding up here because just for the sake of time, we're not going to do any small dollar items. So the rent's $500, okay? Now, I'm your personal banker. I understand you guys have no money. So what we've worked out with the group on the right is that you will borrow the money, okay? And you're going to pay this thing called interest, okay? Interest. And what the interest is going to do, don't worry about it. You just keep making your payments, and the interest will start to compound over time. But don't worry about that. Okay, let's roll the dice again. All right, whoa, you roll the dice, and you guys are running here. Oh, man, you look at it. Look at that, you're on Park Place. Sweet. Do you want to buy it? Yes, okay. You buy Park Place, and not only do you get Park Place, but you get the 2-for-1. You got Boardwalk, and yes. And this comes with our hotel upgrade. So now you have hotels. All right. Next, you guys are up. Are you ready to roll? Okay. Woo! You roll the dice, and you're coming around, and oh my goodness. Go to jail. Go to jail. You know what? What is it with you guys? Why do you have to break the law? Why can't you play by the rules? You know what? I'm just disappointed. That's all I'm saying. Okay, you guys, let's roll the dice one more time. Okay, here you go. Hey, wait a minute. Railroads, do you want them? Okay, great. Now, the cool thing about the railroads, you own those, that the railroads basically take you to all these different towns, and every town that you visit, you get to buy property. So now you own all the property on the board. Yay! Except for there's a little ghetto down here called Baltic Avenue and Mediterranean Avenue, and those are still those are still, you guys didn't want that. But you did buy Connecticut Avenue just to make sure that the other group doesn't get a monopoly. Okay, let's roll the dice again. You guys are out of jail, great, but you are on probation, so don't screw up. And you roll the dice again, and this time you come around, and whoa, you're landing on, Boardwalk. Wow. Big rent. Don't worry about it. That original debt that you guys took out, the $500, that you now owe $5,000 because of, it's the interest. Don't worry about it. You owe $5,000. Just keep making your monthly payments. You did get another roll, though. So you get to roll again. Whoa, that's cool. You roll again, and hey, you landed on Oriental Avenue. You know what? This is a vacant lot. Do you want to buy it? It's got a lot of garbage and stuff on it because, there were some buildings there, but they're torn down. It's a vacant lot. Do you guys want to buy it? Okay, you guys are indecisive. Actually, reviewed your application. It doesn't really matter because your credit is awful. And if you had just kept making those payments like I told you, maybe we could work something out. But you use that to pay your debt, dude. $200 goes to pay off the now $15,000 that you owe. And the interest keeps going up, and you guys are not even making your monthly payments, so I'd love to work with you, but you're not going to be able to buy this property. Okay, now we could keep playing, but how many of you like this game? Woo! You know, as the game wore on, I just have to say, and I'm going to try not to be emotional here, but I just have to say, as the game wore on, I was more and more impressed with you. You group on the right here, you just work so hard and you've been so successful, and I feel like you deserve it, you know, the rewards that you've gotten. I recognize, though, that it was that you did benefit from the free labor that you got from the group on the left as they were trying to work off their debt. But you know what? That's how the game is played. Now, you guys, how do you feel about this game? Yay! No, yeah. Let me ask you this. What can we do for you? How can we make it fair?
Send them to jail.
Send them to jail. Yeah, I think they probably would make bail pretty easy. Anybody else? Do you have a way that we could make this game fair?
Play by the same rules.
Play by the same rules. What's your name? Micah. Okay, Micah has a proposal. Micah's saying, what if we play by the same rules? So what if we say right now, you guys get to buy property as well, okay? Isn't that the same rule? They get to buy property, you get to buy property, rules are even. How do you feel about the game now? Yeah, all right. Now the trouble with that situation is you still have no money, okay? You're still looking at a $15,000 debt that's growing with compound interest. But the game is now fair, is it not? Any objections? You feel like the game is fair now? Their assets are actually in the millions right now, if not billions, with all those hotels. Somebody yelled out another proposal. What were you saying? What's your name? Matt says he would like for you guys, group on the right, to give to the group on the left half of your properties. What do you guys think about that proposal? You've only got one other person on your team that even goes along with that plan. Any other suggestions you guys have? How do we make this fair? How can this be a win for you? Somebody? Yes? What's your name? Elijah says weapons. Weapons, okay. We're going to pause right there. Okay, I think Elijah's comment really takes us to another level. And it points out how resentments can build up over time. And while they may not have been doing anything about it, there's something festering over here in the group on the left, to the point where now they are seeking weapons. Now, what I'm describing to you is not at all hypothetical. It, in fact, isn't really a game. This is exactly what happened in the United States of America. As this country was developing, there were groups of people who could not buy property. If you notice, I'm of African descent. You may have noticed that. My people, for instance, were among those who, through a very extended period of time, were not allowed to buy property. Not only that, but their labor was being used by force to develop wealth for the other group. And when that system came to an end, it came to an end with no sharing of resources, just basically, okay, now the game is fair, now you're playing by the same rules, although there is no property to be had, you have no assets, and you have no credit. There was also a practice called sharecropping, and that is where a person who was a recently released slave would work for their former slave owner, but because they have no assets, they have no tools, they have no seed to plant, and they have no land, they are paying rent for the land, they are buying the seed on credit, they are buying their tools on credit, and the compound interest causes them to owe more at the end of the harvest season than they did before they planted. This went on in the United States for quite some time. There were also those 12 million people, former landowners within the United States, who were killed through through ethnic cleansing in the westward expansion of the United States known as Manifest Destiny. And they were given plots of land at various periods of time, which was then confiscated from them as they were moved to rockier and less desirable pieces of land over time. There were people who were brought in as different immigrants and also experienced, different types of differences in rules, etc. And the approach that we've taken thus far as a country to try to make things fair, the main approach has been to say, let's even the playing field so the rules are now fair. But there has not been a look back to say, wait a minute, is there some kind of reset button that needs to be pressed here? When there are attempts to do that kind of thing, you can imagine the group on the right begins to object to Matthew, was it? You trying to take 50% of their property. In fact, the original idea for the released slaves was that they would be given 40 acres and a mule. That never happened until Spike Lee started his 40 Acre and a Mule film company, just to kind of remind people of that agreement. This was the practice, however, in Israel, where when a person was an indentured servant for 7 years, they would be released with assets. They were always let go with property. And the same was true even in the Roman Empire and their system of slavery. So these things that we're describing and what we just experienced in this game, which hopefully didn't feel very good for those of you on the left, is something that is the experience of many people in the world, even here in the United States. How then do you take groups of people and bring them together and have large-scale reconciliation, redemption of conflict within groups? How do you make that happen? One of the ways that the Bible says does not work is you forgive and forget. You act like nothing ever happened, and you move on from today. The Bible does not advocate that approach to things. We saw over and over again in the case of the Amalekites that God said, you shall not forget. You shall remember. You are not being given permission to forgive and move on. Something has to be done. Let me tell you a scary story in the Bible, and I'm going to allow you, because you're Bible scholars and you think biblically about everything here at Biola, I want you to look up this story. How many of you heard of the Gibeonites? Wave your hand, have you heard of the Gibeonites? Now, the Gibeonites were people who used the method of deceit. I talked about this actually in the morning session, that one of the pressures on people who are oppressed is to use deceit to try to overcome your oppressor. They were those who lived in the land of Canaan, and they were about to be completely wiped out by Joshua and the advancing Israeli or Hebrew armies as they came into the land of Canaan. These Gibeonites resorted to deception. They got some old, worn-out, beat-up shoes and some moldy bread, and they came to Joshua and his people, and they said, we came from a long ways off, long journey. Look at our worn-out shoes and our moldy bread that was fresh when we left home, and we just want to make a treaty with you guys. We live really far away. Joshua didn't even pray about it. He made the treaty. Off they went. He finds out later they are next-door neighbors. They live right nearby, and they lied. And he calls them in and he says, why did you lie to us? And Joshua had made a vow before the Lord saying he would not kill the Gibeonites. He made a peace treaty with them. So he made this vow and he says, you deceived us. I made the vow because you lied to me. And because of it, you are going to be slaves in Israel. You're going to be water carriers and woodcutters in Israel from generation to generation. You know what they said? Hey, that's all good. That's better than dying. So great, we'll be woodcutters and water carriers. And later on, they got attacked because they made a treaty with Israel. And Joshua went before God and said, should I go defend the Gibeonites? And God said, yes, you have a treaty with them, you go defend them. And the Gibeonites were subsumed into Israel as sort of a second class. Years later, however, this king that we talked about, King Saul, not only did he not kill the Amalekites, he did decide to kill the Gibeonites. And under the reign of David, there was a famine that broke out. This is the part you guys can go ahead and look up. The famine breaks out. They come to David and they say, David, there's a famine. David says, Why is this happening? And he starts to pray, and the prophet comes to him and says, David, this is because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. Saul started to slaughter the Gibeonites, and he violated the treaty that Joshua had made. He violated the vow that Joshua made to the Lord, and that's the reason why there's a famine going on. David then goes to the leaders of the Gibeonites, and he says, what can I do for you? Now, if you were the Gibeonites, what would you ask for? Yell it out, just yell it out. No. Somebody said food, somebody said freedom, compensation. Do you know what they asked for? They said, give us 7 sons of Saul that we may kill them. You see, let me jump ahead here. When you are trying to bring groups together, there's certain things, this is not an exhaustive list, but there's certain things that you really need if you're going to bring about large-scale reconciliation and the redemption of conflict at a large scale, at a national level, at a group or tribal level. There's certain things you are going to need in order to pull that off. One of them is you have to agree upon the truth of the past. Now, you'll never get to the point where both sides agree totally upon the narrative of the past, but there's certain things we're going to need to come to an agreement. This is what happened. This is the basis of the conversation, for instance, between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. In chapter 4 of John's Gospel, Jesus meets this Samaritan woman, and as you know, there was a history of conflict among the Jews and the Samaritans. They argued about where they should worship. They argued about how worship was supposed to be done. The Samaritans at one point attacked the temple. The Jews attacked the Samaritan temple. As Jesus is having this conversation with this woman, at one point she realizes, man, this guy knows all about my love life and all the terrible experiences I've had, and yet he respects me enough to have a conversation with me, cross-cultural and cross-gender, which is totally taboo. She starts to get religious, and she says to Jesus in verse 19 of chapter 4 of John, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. Jesus says to her, look, this dispute, this age-old argument between you Samaritans and us Jews about where's the best place to worship, the whole thing is about to become a moot point. In fact, it already is a moot point because God is looking for people to worship him in spirit and in truth, and it doesn't matter what location, and the temple is about to be obsolete. But let me just get one thing clear with you. Salvation is from the Jews, and you don't know what you're talking about. Sounds a little harsh that Jesus would say that. But that's what he says to her. Let's be clear, salvation is from the Jews, and you don't know what you're talking about. We worship what we know, you worship what you don't know. Jesus is saying, we can move on from here. We can go into a time where we're all worshiping together, but we're going to need to get some facts straight about the past. There's another situation that's even more shocking when Jesus is talking to the Syrophoenician woman. And she says, hey, I need you to do this healing for me. And Jesus says, should I take the bread of the children and throw it to the dogs? And while that seems like, did Jesus really say that? And people have tried to figure out, is he like doing a sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of thing with her to get the disciples to see how racist they are and all of this? But actually, what Jesus is doing, he may be doing that, and I think he probably is doing that. But I think another thing that he's doing is he's trying to find out, is this woman willing to own the past? Is she willing to own up to the fact that she has no claim on Jesus? Is she willing to recognize that there is a history of oppression of the Jewish people by her people? Or does she feel entitled? And if she feels entitled, she's going to walk away with nothing. But when she's willing to set the facts straight about the past and say, you know what? All I'm asking for is the crumbs that fall from the table. Jesus says that's enough faith to get it done. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was a very dangerous enterprise. A friend of mine, a guy by the name of Hendrik Kotze, was at a school for Afrikaan young men. It was an all-boys school, all-white school, people of Dutch heritage. Their native language is Afrikaans. That's what they spoke with one another. And along comes this guy, Nelson Mandela, after being in prison for 25 years. And he comes out of prison and becomes the new president of South Africa. And Hindre and his associates had been taught as young Afrikaan boys, there better never be a time when the black majority takes over in South Africa, because if it happens, it's going to be a total bloodbath. Because there are too many of them, and if they get the weapons and the power, we're in trouble. And then here comes this towering figure of Nelson Mandela to this boys' school, and Hindre greeted him, and Mandela walks up, and even though they both know English, Mandela says to Hindre in Afrikaans, "What will be your part in building the new South Africa, Hindre?" And he says to him, "We have a common goal of building a peaceful new future together." And he offers his friendship, and they move on from there. But they knew that they couldn't do it without addressing the past. And so what they did in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is say, we're going to have everybody come together, whether you were part of the rebel armies or part of the government and the police force, and you've done any atrocities, you're going to come forward, you're going to tell the truth about what happened, and we're going to trust the gospel of Jesus Christ to heal this nation and prevent the bloodbath. We're going to apply the gospel at a national level and try to save our country by believing what Jesus said. And in doing that, you were not guaranteed that you would not be punished. And you were not required to forgive. And he tells one story of a woman who sat there and asks this police officer to tell her what happened to my husband. And this police officer says, "We tied him to a chair, we poured gasoline on him, and we burned him." And this woman, in shock and horror, when the moment passed, says to this man, "I require two things of you. First, I want you to tell me what you did with his remains so that I may go and pay my respects to my husband. And second, I can see that you have carried this weight and it's destroying you, and I want you to come to my home so that I can be a mother to you." And the man fainted. The weight of forgiveness was more than he could bear in that moment. And what we understand from the book of Ephesians and from other places throughout the scripture is that Jesus has put himself in the position as the head of every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. And he says, I am now permitting you to forgive. I am asking you on the left, whatever they owe you, count it to my account. The things that can't be fixed. Now, we need to make amends for the things that can. If I stole from you, Matthew, and I come to you and say, "Hey man, I'm sorry, are we good?" And then the next day you see me wearing some fresh sneakers and I'm scooting around on a brand new Vespa with a bright red helmet. Are you going to be a little upset that maybe I could have paid you back your $50 that I stole when you weren't looking? See, if you can fix it, there's a requirement, if we're going to move forward, that I need to be honest about what happened in the past and I need to try to fix it. But if you killed somebody, what are you going to do? David handed over these 7 sons of Saul to the Gibeonites. They said, "Let us kill 7 sons of Saul." David handed over the 7 sons, and they killed them. And they hung their bodies out and did not even bury them. And one of the sisters fought off the birds until finally David has them buried. And then the famine ends. And God never comments further than that. But I think what the story shows us is that reconciliation at that moment, because the damage was so deep, required bloodshed. David handed over these descendants of Saul to be killed, to shed blood, to make it even. And God said, famine over. And there are some conflicts that we will deal with in the world. You may become a diplomat in the midst of a hot situation. And there are some conflicts where people have lost loved ones, where they don't feel that they're free to let it go because the blood has been shed, and they would demonstrate a lack of loyalty if they did that. We need to be able to interpose the cross and say, let Jesus pay the penalty for what was done to you. Let him be the head of the tribe that offended you, and let the murder of Jesus be enough to pay the penalty, and the bloodshed can stop here. That is what happened in South Africa. And that is what Jesus is doing as he brings all of the tribes of the world together He's saying we can be honest about the past. We can do our best to reconcile. And in the end, whatever cannot be corrected, we count it to his account and let the blood of the cross make it even.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.